I watched my cousin pack her bags for a life that felt more like a prison sentence than a romance. But it wasn't the 30-year age gap that chilled me to the bone. It was the secret her new boyfriend was hiding in his deleted search history. Why would a girl with her entire life ahead of her choose to disappear into the shadow of a man old enough to be her father? Especially after what his last fiancé discovered about his late-night habits. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about a bad relationship. It's about the moment I realized that sometimes you have to let the people you love drown before they pull you under with them. We grew up more like sisters than cousins. You know that kind of bond where you don't even need to finish your sentences because the other person already knows exactly what you're thinking? That was us. We shared secrets, clothes, and dreams of what our lives would look like when we finally hit our 20s. But as we got older, I started to notice a shift in her. It was subtle at first. A preference for older crowds, a certain disdain for people our own age. But I never imagined it would lead us to where we are now. It all started on a random Tuesday. We were grabbing coffee, and she had this glow about her, a kind of manic energy that I hadn't seen in a long time. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide and sparkling, and told me she'd finally found the one. She talked about him like he was a god, describing his maturity, his stability, and how he finally understood her in a way no one else ever could. I was happy for her, truly. I wanted her to find peace. But then, she pulled out her phone to show me a picture. The air left my lungs the second I saw him. This wasn't a guy in his late 20s or even his 30s. The man staring back at me from the screen had deep-set wrinkles around his eyes and salt and pepper hair that was leaning much more towards salt. He looked like someone I'd see at a parent-teacher conference, not someone my 20-year-old cousin should be spending her nights with. I remember looking at her, then back at the photo, and my voice just kind of failed me. I think I managed to stammer out something like, "You're kidding, right? Is this a joke?" She didn't laugh. Her face hardened instantly, that defensive wall she'd built up over the years slamming into place. She told me his name was David and that he was 50. 50. For context, my own uncle, her father, is 52. The math was devastating. This man had been graduating high school while she was still a decade away from even being born. He had lived an entire lifetime, experienced a marriage, a career, and decades of adulthood, while she was still trying to figure out how to file her own taxes. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. I told myself that maybe it was just a phase, or maybe he was one of those rare, genuine souls who just happened to fall for someone younger. But things didn't stay normal for long. Within just a few months, the escalation was dizzying. It was like she was being fast-tracked into a life she wasn't ready for. First, she started staying at his place every night. Then, the bombshell dropped. She was dropping out of college. She had worked so hard to get in, and suddenly, it didn't matter anymore. She said David would take care of her, that she didn't need a degree because she was going to help him with his business. My stomach did a slow roll when she told me that. Financial independence is the only thing that keeps you safe in this world, and she was handing her leash over to a man she barely knew. It felt like she was erasing herself, piece by piece, to fit into the corners of his life. But as concerning as the age gap and the school situation were, they were nothing compared to the news that reached me a few weeks later. I have a friend who moves in the same social circles as David's ex-fiancée. It's a small world, and secrets in towns like ours have a way of leaking out like toxic waste. This friend reached out to me, hesitant at first, but eventually she couldn't keep it in. She told me the real reason David's last relationship ended. It wasn't irreconcilable differences, or growing apart like he'd told my cousin. His ex-fiancée had called off the wedding after she went through his computer. The moment I heard that, I felt physically ill. It wasn't just a creepy age gap anymore. It was a pattern. It was a predator. Hearing that made everything click into place in the worst way possible. He didn't want my cousin because she was mature for her age. He wanted her because she was young enough to be controlled and old enough to be legal. The mature excuse is the oldest trick in the book for men like that. I knew I couldn't stay silent. I knew that if I didn't say something and something happened to her, I'd never forgive myself. So I called her. I invited her over, thinking if I could just get her away from his house, away from his influence for an hour, I could make her see reason. But the girl who walked through my door wasn't the cousin I grew up with. She looked tired, her eyes darting around, and she kept checking her phone every 30 seconds. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her straight up that the whole situation felt disturbing. I told her that a 50-year-old man dating a 20-year-old is a red flag big enough to cover a stadium, but that the information about the minors was a deal breaker. I expected her to be shocked. I expected her to cry, or at least to ask for proof. But instead, she got angry. Not at him, at me. She started screaming that I was judging her, that I didn't want her to be happy, and that I was just jealous because she'd found someone who could provide for her. The conversation turned toxic so fast it made my head spin. I told her it was gross. I told her he was literally old enough to be her father and that he was preying on her. I told her she was throwing her life away for a man who looked at teenage girls as a hobby. That was the last time we spoke in person. I couldn't do it anymore. The ick factor was too high, and the danger felt too real. I realized that by hanging around and pretending to be okay with it, I was essentially condoning it. I was giving him access to me and the rest of our family. So I did the only thing I could to protect my own peace. I cut her off. I stopped answering the calls, I stopped replying to the texts, and I retreated. But the drama didn't stop there. It turns out, I wasn't the only one who felt this way. As the news about David's past began to circulate through the family grapevine, one by one, my aunts, uncles, and even some of our mutual friends started to pull away. The family dinners got smaller. The group chats went silent. And now, she's standing in the middle of a vacuum, wondering why the world has gone cold. The silence that followed our blowout was louder than any of the screaming we'd done. It was that heavy, suffocating kind of silence that settles over a family when a secret becomes too big to ignore. For a few weeks, I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing. I stayed off social media, avoided the family group chats, and tried to focus on my own life. But the thing about family is that you're never truly disconnected, no matter how many miles or blocked numbers you put between you. The whispers always find a way back. I started hearing through the grapevine that my cousin was spiraling, but not in the way you'd think. She wasn't heartbroken or scared. She was indignant. She was going on this crusade, calling every relative who would listen, crying about how I had poisoned everyone against her. She painted herself as the victim of a narrow-minded family that couldn't handle true love. But as the stories started to circulate, I realized there was a much darker layer to this whole thing that I hadn't even fully grasped yet. I sat down with my mother one Sunday afternoon. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She told me that she'd been doing some digging, talking to some of the older aunts who had been around for my cousin's previous adventures. And that's when the pattern really started to emerge. You see, this wasn't just a one-off mistake. This wasn't a girl who had accidentally fallen for the wrong guy. This was a lifestyle choice she had been making for years. My mother reminded me of the time 3 years ago when my cousin had disappeared for a weekend, only to turn up at a police station 2 towns over. At the time, she told us she'd been harassed by an older man she met at a diner. We all rallied around her. We stayed up with her, brought her meals, and told her it wasn't her fault. But then, a week later, she was back at that same diner, sitting in the same booth with that same man. It happened again a year later with an older woman she'd met through a hobby group. It always followed the same script, the intense connection, the sudden isolation from the family, a massive blow-up involving the police or some kind of dramatic intervention. And then she'd run right back to the person she claimed was hurting her. It was like she was addicted to the chaos. Or maybe she was addicted to the power dynamic of being with someone so much older. She seemed to thrive in these situations, where she could play the role of the misunderstood heroine in a tragic romance. But this time, with David, it felt different. It felt more permanent. And then came the detail that truly broke me. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that she and David didn't just meet on a dating app a few months ago. They had been talking since she was 17. Think about that for a second. When she was still a minor, still living under her parents' roof, still trying to pass high school exams, this 50-year-old man was in her DMs. He was grooming her. He was waiting for that clock to strike midnight on her 18th birthday so he could claim her. The dating app story was just a cover-up to make it look legal, to make it look like two consenting adults met by chance. But the reality was far more calculated. He had been playing the long game, and she had walked right into his trap. Or worse, she had helped him set it. Knowing that changed everything. It made my skin crawl every time I thought about them together. It wasn't just a gross age gap anymore. It was a crime that had been masked by time. I felt this overwhelming urge to go to her house, grab her by the shoulders, and shake her until she saw the truth. But I knew it wouldn't work. I had already tried that, and all it did was push her further into his arms. The rest of the family was starting to feel the weight of it too. My uncle, her father, was a shell of a man. How do you process the fact that your daughter is living with a man your age? A man who targeted her when she was a child? He didn't know whether to fight David or mourn his daughter. The tension was tearing the family apart. People stopped hosting holidays because no one knew if she would show up with him on her arm. No one wanted to be the one to tell her she couldn't bring him, but no one wanted him in their home either. Eventually, the pressure became too much for her. She started reaching out again, but this time, her tone had shifted. She wasn't just angry anymore. She sounded desperate. She started sending these long, rambling texts to me and our other cousins, asking why we were abandoning her. She said she felt like she was being excommunicated for her choices. She kept saying, "I'm an adult now. I can make my own decisions. Why can't you just be happy that I'm happy?" It's the hardest question to answer when the person asking it is blinded by their own dysfunction. How do you tell someone that their happiness looks like a slow-motion suicide? How do you explain that by standing by and watching, you're becoming an accomplice to their destruction? I remember sitting in my room, staring at a text from her that said, "I thought you were my best friend. I thought you'd always have my back. But you're just like the rest of them. You're judging me because David is successful and mature, and you can't handle that I don't need you anymore." I wanted to reply. I wanted to tell her about the ex-fiancé. I wanted to tell her about the police reports from his past that were starting to surface. I wanted to tell her that successful and mature men don't spend their time hunting teenagers online. But I realized that she already knew. Deep down, she had to know. She had seen the red flags. She had heard the warnings, and she had chosen to stay. She wasn't a victim of ignorance. She was a victim of her own refusal to see the truth. That was the moment I realized that cutting her off wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of survival. If I kept engaging with her, I was just feeding into the drama she craved. I was giving her the conflict she used to justify running back to him. The only way to stop the cycle was to step out of it entirely. But then something happened that made me wonder if I had made the wrong call. I got a phone call in the middle of the night. It wasn't from her. It was from a number I didn't recognize. When I picked up, all I heard was heavy breathing and the sound of someone crying in the background. My heart dropped. I thought, this is it. Something happened. He hurt her. I whispered her name into the phone. "Is that you? Are you okay?" The voice on the other end wasn't hers. It was a man's voice, deep, calm, and terrifyingly composed. He said, "She's fine. She's just a little upset. But you need to stop talking about me. You're making things very difficult for her, and I don't think you want to see her any more upset than she already is." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the phone trembling in my hand, realizing that David wasn't just a creep. He was a threat, and he knew exactly who I was. That phone call changed everything. The silence in my room after the line went dead was heavy, like the air right before a massive storm breaks. I sat there on the edge of my bed, my fingers still gripping the phone so hard they were white. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the way he said them. He sounded so calm, so entitled, like he was a father disciplining a disobedient child rather than a 50-year-old man threatening his girlfriend's cousin. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of that night. Every time the house creaked or a car drove past my window, my heart would jump into my throat. I kept replaying his voice in my head. "You're making things very difficult for her." It was a classic manipulator's move, framing his own aggression as a defense of her. He wasn't the problem. I was. My concern was the difficulty. My voice was the upset. The next morning, I drove over to my parents' house. I needed to tell someone, but I felt this weird sense of guilt, like I was the one bringing more drama into an already burning situation. When I walked in, I saw my uncle, my cousin's dad, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 3 months. His shoulders were hunched, and the light in his eyes was just gone. I told them about the call. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but my uncle didn't even look up. He just stared at the table and whispered, "He's got her. He's really got her this time." That's when the conversation turned to her history, the stuff we all knew but didn't want to talk about. See, my cousin had a pattern, a dark cycle that we'd all tried to ignore because it was too painful to face. It wasn't just David. Before him, there was a 40-year-old woman she'd met at a community college event when she was barely 18. Before that, there was a man in his late 40s who she claimed was mentoring her in photography. Every single time, it ended in disaster. She would disappear for days. We'd call the police. There would be a massive scene involving restraining orders or late-night pickups from motel rooms. And then, within 48 hours, she'd be right back with them. She didn't just stumble into these relationships. She sought them out. She frequented apps and forums specifically designed for people looking for arrangement or age gap relationships. But why? That was the question that haunted our family. She came from a good home. She was loved. She was brilliant. But it was like she had this void inside her that only the validation of someone much older could fill. She craved a kind of control that felt like protection, even when it was actually a cage. My uncle finally looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "She told me she's changing her phone number," he said. "She said David thinks it's better if she starts fresh. No more negative influences. That's what he's calling us now. We're the negative influences because we remember who she was before he found her." It was the classic playbook of an abuser. Isolate the victim. Make them believe that their family is the enemy. Cut off their ties to their past so that the only person they have left to rely on is you. And it was working. She was dropping out of school, she was moving into his house, and now she was cutting off the people who had known her since she was in diapers. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. This man was 50 years old. He should have been focusing on his retirement plan, not on dismantling a 20-year-old's life. But then I remembered the detail about the minors. That wasn't just a red flag. It was a siren. If he had been talking to children online, what was he doing with my cousin when the doors were locked? Was he training her? Was he using her to find more victims? The thoughts were so dark, I had to physically shake my head to get rid of them. I decided I couldn't just sit back and let him win. I spent the afternoon digging. I knew the name of the ex-fiancée, and after a few hours of scouring social media and reaching out to mutual acquaintances, I managed to get her on the phone. She was hesitant at first, terrified that David would find out she was talking to me. Her voice was shaking so much I could barely understand her. "He's a monster," she told me, her voice a jagged whisper. "He doesn't love people, he owns them." When I found those messages, those pictures, I thought my heart was going to stop. And when I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He just told me I was too old to understand what he needed. He told me he needed new energy. That's what he calls it. New energy. She told me that David had a way of finding girls who were just a little bit broken, just a little bit lost, and making them feel like they were the most important person in the world. He'd shower them with gifts, pay their bills, and tell them they were too mature for people their own age. He'd make them feel like they were part of an elite club that only he held the key to. But the second you question him, she warned, the second you try to have a thought that isn't his, he turns. He'll take everything back. He'll make you feel like you're nothing without him. And he has people, honey. He has friends in places you wouldn't believe. Please, just stay away from him. For your own sake. I hung up the phone, feeling like I needed to take a shower. The reality was so much worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just a gross relationship. It was a calculated, predatory operation. And my cousin was right in the center of it, thinking she was the luckiest girl in the world. I tried one last time to reach her. I sent a long, carefully worded email, knowing he probably had access to her accounts. I didn't mention the ex-fiancé. I didn't mention the minors. I just told her I loved her. I told her that no matter what happened, my door was always open. I told her she didn't have to be mature with me. She could just be my cousin. She replied an hour later. It was short, cold, and clearly edited by someone else. I don't want your love if it comes with judgment. David and I are building a life together. If you can't respect that, then you aren't part of my life anymore. Don't contact me again. That was it. The door didn't just close. It was deadbolted from the other side. The weeks turned into months, and the silence from her end became a permanent fixture in our lives. Our family gatherings were hollow. At Thanksgiving, there was an empty chair where she should have been. My aunt cried over the stuffing. My uncle didn't say a word the whole night. He just stared at the door like he was waiting for her to walk through it and tell us it was all a bad dream. But then I started seeing the photos. She hadn't blocked me on Instagram yet, or maybe she wanted me to see. She started posting these staged, cinematic pictures of her new life. There she was on a yacht, looking tiny next to David's looming frame. There she was in a designer dress that cost more than my car, standing in front of a mirror in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. In every photo, she had this frozen smile. Her eyes looked vacant, like she was staring at something miles away. She looked beautiful, sure, but she also looked like a doll, a possession. She was living the dream, but it looked more like she was being curated for a collection. And then I noticed something in the background of one of the photos. It was a small detail, something most people would have missed. On the coffee table behind her, there was a stack of legal documents and a very specific type of prescription bottle. I zoomed in, my heart hammering against my ribs. I recognized that bottle. It was a heavy-duty sedative, the kind they give to people in high-stress environments or those suffering from severe anxiety. Why would a 20-year-old girl living her best life with her soulmate need enough sedatives to knock out a horse? And those legal documents? They weren't for a business. I could just make out the letterhead. It was a prominent local law firm that specialized in non-disclosure agreements and reputation management. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was becoming his insurance policy. I sat there for hours, staring at that one grainy, zoomed-in photo on my laptop screen. The more I looked at it, the more the perfect life she was projecting started to crumble like wet paper. There it was, the prescription bottle of alprazolam, and those legal documents with the strictly confidential stamp. You don't give a 20-year-old an NDA and a heavy supply of sedatives unless you're trying to bury something or someone. It became clear to me that she wasn't just a girlfriend. She was his living, breathing alibi. Think about it. If a 50-year-old man with a history of questionable interests in minors is suddenly seen everywhere with a beautiful, legal 20-year-old woman, his reputation gets a total facelift. To the outside world, he's just a guy with a younger girlfriend. He's rehabilitated. He's normal. She was the shield he was using to hide his true nature from the world. And he was drugging her and legally binding her to make sure that shield never cracked. I felt this cold, hard knot of resolve form in my chest. I couldn't just sit back and watch her disappear into this guy's basement, literally or metaphorically. I started doing what anyone with a laptop and a grudge does. I went full private investigator. I needed to know what those legal documents were. I needed to know what David was so afraid of that he had to silence a girl who claimed to love him. I spent the next few days digging into David's professional life. On the surface, he was a consultant for high-end real estate. But as I peeled back the layers of LLCs and shell companies, I found a trail of lawsuits that would make your skin crawl. There were dozens of settlements for unspecified grievances. It was a pattern of pay to go away. He didn't just have one ex-fiancée. He had a string of young women who had vanished from his life, all leaving behind a trail of legal silence. But the most disturbing part wasn't the money. It was the timing. Every time a new consultancy project started, a young woman, usually between 18 and 22, would appear on his social media. They'd be draped in jewelry, smiling in front of mansions, and then, after 6 months to a year, they'd just stop existing online. No updates, no "we broke up" posts, nothing. Just a clean slate. I was becoming obsessed. I was staying up until 4 in the morning, my room lit only by the blue light of my monitor, tracking the digital footprints of ghosts. I felt like I was the only person who could see the monster under the bed, while the rest of my family was just crying because the bed was empty. Then I got a break. A girl named Chloe. She had been with David about 4 years ago. She was 21 at the time. I found her on a forum for survivors of narcissistic abuse. She hadn't used his real name, but the details were too specific to be anyone else. The age gap, the business trips, the specific brand of expensive gin he drank, and the NDAs. I reached out to her, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. I told her who I was. I told her about my cousin. I told her I was scared. She didn't reply for 2 days. I thought I'd spooked her. But then, on the third night, my phone buzzed with a link to a private encrypted chat room. "I can't talk long," she typed. Her words came fast, full of typos and raw panic. "He has people who watch for mentions of his name. If he finds out I'm talking to you, he'll sue me for every penny I don't even have. That NDA is a death sentence for your cousin's voice. He makes you sign it under the guise of protecting his business privacy when you're in a honeymoon phase, and you do anything for him. But once you sign it, you're his property." She told me that the sedatives weren't just for anxiety. He'd encourage the girls to take them so they'd be more compliant during his parties. He'd host these networking events with other men his age, men with money and power. And the girls were there to be eye candy and to make the atmosphere feel young and vibrant. "He's not just a creep," Chloe typed. "He's a broker. He brokers access to youth. Your cousin is a commodity to him. And the school? He made me drop out too. He told me it was a waste of time, that he'd teach me everything I needed to know. He does it to make you financially dependent. Once you have no degree, no job, and no family, where are you going to go?" I asked her about the minors. The minors allegation that had broken up his last engagement. Chloe was silent for a long time. Then, "It's worse than you think. He doesn't just talk to them, he scouts them. He looks for the ones who have a history of looking for older mentors. He looks for the ones with the pattern, like your cousin." The air in my room felt like ice. She knew. She knew about my cousin's history before I even mentioned it. David didn't just stumble upon my cousin. He'd been hunting her. He knew she was vulnerable. He knew she had a type. He'd played into her trauma like a virtuoso playing a violin. I thanked Chloe and closed the laptop. I felt a level of nausea I can't even describe. My cousin wasn't in love. She was in the middle of a sophisticated, high-stakes, trafficking-adjacent operation disguised as a May-December romance. And the worst part? She was defending him. She was the one who had told me to stay away. But I couldn't stay away. I decided I had to see her. Not a call, not an email, but a face-to-face. I knew David had a charity gala coming up, one of those events where he could parade his new energy in front of the local elite. I spent my entire savings on a ticket and a dress that made me look like I belonged there. I was going to walk into the lion's den, and I was going to get my cousin out, even if I had to drag her. The night of the gala arrived. The hotel ballroom was dripping in gold and white lilies. The air smelled of expensive perfume and desperation. I scanned the room, my eyes darting between the clusters of gray-haired men and their suspiciously young dates. And then I saw her. She was standing by the bar, wearing a dress that looked like it was made of liquid silver. She looked stunning, but she also looked like she was made of glass. One wrong move and she'd shatter. David was standing right behind her, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. It didn't look like a romantic gesture. It looked like he was holding her in place. I waited until he got distracted by a man in a tuxedo. I moved through the crowd, my heart in my throat. When I got to her, I didn't say a word. I just grabbed her wrist. She jumped, nearly dropping her glass. When she saw it was me, her face went through a dozen emotions in 3 seconds. Shock, fear, anger, and then, for a fleeting moment, pure, unadulterated relief. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her eyes darting toward David. "We're leaving," I whispered. "Now. I know about Chloe. I know about the pills. I know about the NDAs." Her face went pale, deathly pale. "You need to go," she stammered. "He'll see you. You don't understand. He's looking out for me." "Is he?" I asked, looking her dead in the eye. "Then why are you shaking? Why do you have a bottle of Xanax in your purse that could put a lighthouse to sleep? Come with me, right now, and we can go to the police. We can end this." She looked at David, then back at me. For a second, I thought she was going to do it. I thought she was going to drop the glass and run. But then, she saw David looking over. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. He started walking toward us. She wrenched her arm out of my grip. "Get away from me," she said, her voice loud enough for the people around us to turn. "I told you to leave me alone. Why can't you just let me be happy?" David was there then. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned. He put an arm around her and looked at me with a pitying smile. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I thought we discussed boundaries, didn't we?" He looked at me, and I saw it. The mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. Behind the successful businessman facade was a void, a cold, calculating nothingness. "She's coming with me," I said, my voice trembling. David chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. "She's an adult, dear. She stays where she wants to stay, and right now, she wants you to leave. If you don't, I'll have to call security. And I don't think you want that on your record, do you?" I looked at my cousin, pleading with my eyes. She wouldn't look at me. She just tucked herself under his arm, hiding her face against his shoulder. "Go away," she whispered. I was escorted out of the building 5 minutes later. As I stood on the sidewalk in the cold night air, watching the valet park Ferraris and Lamborghinis, I realized I had failed. I had tried to play the hero, but I was just a girl in a cheap dress trying to fight a man who owned the world she was trapped in. But as I walked toward my car, I felt something in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. My cousin must have slipped it into my pocket when I grabbed her wrist. I smoothed it out under a street lamp. It was a receipt from a local pharmacy. On the back, in her messy, frantic handwriting, were 3 words. "Help me. Midnight." The 3 words on that crumpled receipt felt like they were vibrating against my palm. Help me. Midnight. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember the turns I took or the red lights I might have rolled through. My mind was a chaotic storm of adrenaline and terror. For months, I had been the one pushing her away, the one judging her, the one calling her choices gross and disturbing. And I wasn't wrong. It was all of those things. But seeing that note changed the math. It didn't matter anymore that she had sought this out. It didn't matter that she had a history of running into the arms of older men. In that moment, she wasn't a disturbed adult making unhealthy choices. She was my little cousin, and she was drowning. I looked at my watch. 10:45 p.m. I had an hour and 15 minutes to figure out a plan, but my brain felt like it was misfiring. Who do you call when someone is being held captive in a prison they walked into willingly? If I called the police, what would I say? My adult cousin is at her boyfriend's house and she's unhappy? They'd tell me it's a civil matter. If I called her dad, my uncle, he'd probably show up with a shotgun and end up in prison himself. I realized I was the only one who could do this. I was the only one who knew about the note. I was the only one he wouldn't expect to see again so soon. I spent the next hour gathering things. I grabbed a spare set of car keys, a heavy flashlight, and my old college hoodie, something nondescript. I drove back toward David's neighborhood, but I didn't park anywhere near his street. He had cameras. I'd seen them when I drove past his house weeks ago. He had a Ring doorbell, floodlights, and a security system that probably cost more than my entire education. He was a man who valued privacy, which is just a rich man's word for secrecy. I parked 3 blocks away in the shadows of a park and walked the rest of the way. The neighborhood was one of those eerie, quiet places where the houses are set so far back from the road that you can't hear a neighbor scream. The air was biting, and every snap of a twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I reached the perimeter of his property at 11:50 p.m. His house was a massive, modern structure of glass and cold stone. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end corporate headquarters. I crept along the tree line, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was looking for the back gate, the one that led toward the wooded area behind the pool house. At exactly midnight, I saw a shadow move. The back door of the kitchen opened just a crack. A sliver of yellow light spilled out onto the patio, and then she appeared. She wasn't wearing the silver gala dress anymore. She was in an oversized sweatshirt and leggings, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She looked small. So incredibly small. She didn't run. She moved with this agonizingly slow, calculated caution, looking back over her shoulder every 2 steps. She reached the edge of the patio and then bolted for the trees. I stepped out from behind a large oak tree, and for a second I thought she was going to scream. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the moonlight like a panicked animal. "I'm here," I whispered, reaching out to catch her as she practically fell into my arms. She was shaking, not just a little, but a full-body tremor that felt like her bones were rattling. She smelled like that heavy floral perfume from the gala, but underneath it, there was the sharp, metallic scent of sweat and fear. "We have to go," she breathed, her voice so thin it barely carried the 3 inches to my ear. "He's sleeping, but he wakes up. He has an app. He checks the sensors. We have to go now." "My car is 3 blocks away," I said, gripping her hand. "Can you run?" She nodded, but as we started to move through the brush, she stumbled. I caught her, and that's when I felt it. The dampness on her sleeve. I pulled back for a second, and even in the dim light, I could see the dark stain. "What is this?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "Did he hurt you?" "It's nothing," she hissed, pulling her arm away. Please, just get me out of here. If he finds out I'm gone, he'll use the papers. He told me he'd ruin Dad. He has photos, things he took before I was 18. He told me if I ever left, he'd send them to everyone. He'd put them online. He said he'd make sure I never get a job, never have a life." The sheer scale of the horror hit me then. This wasn't just about an age gap. This was a total 360-degree entrapment. He had groomed her, documented her, and then used that documentation as a leash. He had isolated her from us so that when the blackmail started, she'd feel too ashamed to come home. He had weaponized her own history against her. We made it to the street, staying in the shadows of the overgrown hedges. Every time a car headlight appeared in the distance, We ducked down, pressed against the cold earth. I felt like I was in a spy movie, but the stakes were my cousin's soul. We reached my car, and the second the doors locked, she collapsed. The strong facade she'd tried to maintain at the gala, the happy mask she'd worn for months, it all evaporated. She began to sob, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from her very marrow. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I thought I was smarter than him. I thought I could handle it. I thought someone finally loved me for being mature." I didn't say I told you so. I didn't point out the obvious. I just drove. I drove as fast and as far as I could, heading toward a small cabin my family owned 3 hours away. I knew we couldn't go to my house or my parents' house. David would check there first. We needed a place where the world couldn't find us. As we hit the highway, she started talking. It was like a dam had broken. She told me about the meetings David had with his friends. She told me how he'd record their conversations, how he'd keep files on everyone, not just the girls, but the businessmen too. He was a collector of secrets. That consultancy business, it was just a front for a high-level extortion ring. And the girls, the new energy, were the bait. "He told me I was special," she whispered, staring out the window at the passing blur of trees. "He told me he was going to make me his partner. But then the NDAs came, and the pills. He started giving me vitamins every morning. I felt like I was living underwater. I'd wake up and hours would be gone. I'd have bruises I didn't remember getting." She pulled up her sleeve again, and this time, under the car's interior light, I saw the truth. It wasn't just a cut. There were finger-shaped bruises cinched around her bicep. "I saw the laptop," she said, her voice turning cold. "A week ago, he forgot to lock his office. I went in, I found the folders. There are dozens of us. Chloe, Sarah, Mia. And then there were folders with no names. Just dates. Dates from years ago. Dates when I was 17. She looked at me, and the vacant look in her eyes was replaced by something much sharper. Something like vengeance. "I didn't just leave, Nade," she said, reaching into the pocket of her sweatshirt. She pulled out a small silver USB drive. "I took his life with me." My heart stopped. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was a war. If David realized she had that drive, he wouldn't just be looking for a girlfriend. He'd be hunting a witness. Just then, my phone buzzed in the center console. It was a FaceTime request. The caller ID simply said, "David." The phone on the center console felt like a live grenade. David's face wasn't on the screen, just the standard incoming call graphic, but I could practically feel his presence filling the car, suffocating us. My cousin's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that told me she was on the verge of a total collapse. "Don't answer it," she whispered, her hands clawing at the fabric of her leggings. "Please, don't answer it." I stared at the name. David. It looked so normal, so benign, just a name. But I knew the monster behind the letters. I didn't answer, but I didn't decline it either. I let it vibrate until it timed out, the silence that followed feeling even heavier than the ringing. Seconds later, my phone chimed. A text message. "I know you're in the car with her. I can see your GPS, Nami. You have 10 minutes to turn that car around before I release the first set of photos to your uncle. Don't be a hero. You aren't built for it." Ice water flooded my veins. GPS. Of course. My phone, her phone. He probably had tracking software on both. And then there was the car itself. Most modern cars have built-in tracking systems. I looked at the dashboard, suddenly feeling like I was driving a glass box. He was watching us. "Give me your phone," I said, my voice tight. She handed it over without a word. I didn't even look at it. I rolled down the window and hurled it out into the darkness. A second later, I did the same with mine. The loss of the digital connection felt like losing a limb, but it was the only way to go dark. We were now officially off the grid, driving into the blackness of the state forest with nothing but a half tank of gas and a USB drive that could either save us or get us killed. We drove in silence for the next hour. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see a pair of high beams appearing out of the mist, closing the gap. My cousin had curled into a ball in the passenger seat, her forehead pressed against the cold glass of the window. "Why did you do it?" I asked softly, the question finally breaking through the wall of adrenaline. "I mean, really, you knew what people said. You saw the red flags. Why him?" She didn't move for a long time. I thought she might have fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice muffled by the glass. "Because he made me feel like I had already won." She turned her head to look at me, and I saw the hollowed-out version of the girl I used to know. Everyone our age? They're all so loud and lost. They're struggling to find jobs, struggling to be noticed. David looked at me and told me I was already there. He told me I was advanced. He treated me like a partner, not a project. Or at least, that's what he wanted me to think. She took a shaky breath. "You said I have a history of this. And you're right, I do. But it's not because I like old men. It's because I hate being 20. I hate being young and dumb. I wanted to skip the part of my life where I was invisible. David saw that. He used it. He made my life feel like a movie, and by the time I realized it was a horror film, he already had the keys to every door." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. It wasn't about sex or money. It was about the desperate, frantic need to be seen as something more than a kid. And men like David, they specialize in that specific type of hunger. They find the girls who want to grow up too fast, and they give them a ladder, not telling them the top of it is leaned against a cage. We reached the cabin around 3 a.m. It was a small, rustic place my grandfather had built in the 70s. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the wind in the pines and the sound of the creek. I led her inside, the air smelling of cedar and old dust. I started a fire in the hearth while she sat on the edge of the sofa, still clutching that USB drive like it was a holy relic. Once the room warmed up, I brought out my old laptop, the one I'd used in college that didn't have a SIM card or an active internet connection. "Do you want to see what's on it?" I asked. She looked at the laptop, then at the drive. She looked terrified. "If we look, there's no going back. If we know what's on there, we become the difficulty he talked about. We become the people who have to be dealt with." "We're already there," I reminded her. "He's already threatened to ruin your dad. He's already tracking us. We need leverage. We need to know exactly how much power we actually have." She handed me the drive. Her hand was cold as ice. I plugged it in. The little blue light on the side of the drive flickered, a heartbeat in the dark. A window popped up on the screen. There were dozens of folders, all labeled with dates and initials. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I clicked on a folder labeled Archive Marketing. It wasn't marketing. It was a database. Names, ages, social security numbers, and investment tiers. David wasn't just a consultant. He was running a high-end social club for men of a certain tax bracket. The girls weren't just girlfriends. They were assets. There were spreadsheets detailing maintenance costs, rent, clothing, medical expenses, the pills, and the return on investment provided by each girl. My cousin was listed there. She had a file. I opened it and my stomach turned. It contained everything: her high school transcripts, her bank statements, and a collection of photos that made me want to scream. Some were from the gala, some were from the house, and some were taken through a window, months before they even officially met. He had been stalking her since she was 17. The dating app story was a complete fabrication. He had watched her, studied her, and then manufactured a chance meeting that was actually a trap designed years in advance. But as I scrolled further down, I found the folder that David was truly afraid of. It wasn't labeled with a name. It was labeled The Founders. Inside were videos. They weren't from his house. They were from a cabin, not unlike this one, but much more luxurious. In the videos, David wasn't the star. He was the cameraman. He was filming other men whose faces I recognized from the local news, from corporate boards, from the city council. They were doing things that would send them to prison for the rest of their lives. "Oh my God," my cousin whispered, her hand over her mouth. "He wasn't just using us for his own sick habit. He was using us to film them." David was a blackmailer. He was using young, vulnerable women to lure powerful men into compromising positions, recording the evidence, and then using that evidence to build his consulting empire. He was the middleman of misery, and my cousin had just walked out of his house with the only copy of his insurance policy. Suddenly, the quiet of the woods felt a lot less like a sanctuary and a lot more like a trap. We weren't just dealing with a creepy older boyfriend anymore. We were holding the secrets of the most powerful people in the state. "We have to go to the FBI," I said, my voice shaking. "Not the local cops, the FBI. We have to leave right now." I stood up to grab my keys, but then I froze. Through the small window of the cabin, I saw a light. It wasn't the moon. It was the sweep of a flashlight, moving slowly through the trees at the edge of the clearing. And then I heard the sound that will haunt me until the day I die. A car door. Soft, deliberate. He hadn't needed the GPS on our phones. He had probably put a physical tracker on my car weeks ago, back when I first started making things difficult. He had been letting me drive. He had been letting me rescue her, just so he could catch us both in a place where no one would hear us. I looked at my cousin. She saw the light too. The terror in her eyes was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She reached into her sweatshirt pocket and pulled out something she hadn't mentioned she'd taken. A small, matte black handgun. "He taught me how to use it," she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "He said a girl in my position should always be able to protect his interests. I guess it's time I protected mine." The sound of the porch step creaking was like a gunshot in the frozen silence of the cabin. It was a heavy, deliberate sound. The sound of someone who wasn't trying to hide anymore because they knew they had already won. I looked at my cousin, and for a heartbeat, the gun in her hand looked like a toy. She was 20 years old. She should have been arguing about roommates or stressing over finals, not holding a matte black semi-automatic while a predator paced outside our door. "Give me the drive, Nun." David's voice drifted through the wood of the door. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't even raising his voice. He sounded like a teacher explaining a simple math problem to a slow student. "I know you have it, and I know you think you're being a hero, but you're just making things messy. And you know how I feel about messes." I looked at the door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. I realized then that the most terrifying thing about David wasn't his anger. It was his absolute lack of it. He didn't see us as people to be fought. He saw us as inventory to be recovered. My cousin stood up, her movement stiff, like a marionette. She walked toward the door, the gun shaking in her grip. "Go away, David," she called out, her voice cracking. "I have the files. I've seen them. I know about the social club. I know about the investments. If you don't leave, I'm sending everything to the feds right now." There was a long pause. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Then, David laughed. It was a soft, pitying sound. "With what signal, sweetheart?" he asked. "You're 3 miles from the nearest cell tower, and I've got a jammer in my pocket. You aren't sending anything. Now open the door. Let's talk about this like adults. You're always telling me how mature you are. Prove it." That was the hook. That was the phrase he had used to reel her in for years. Prove how mature you are. It was his way of telling her that if she disagreed with him, she was just a child. It was a psychological cage, and I could see her beginning to falter. Her shoulders slumped, and the barrel of the gun dipped toward the floor. "Don't listen to him," I whispered, grabbing her shoulder. "He's a blackmailer, a predator, and a liar. There is no adult version of this. There's just the version where we survive." I looked around the room, searching for a way out. The windows were small and high up. The back door led to a steep drop-off toward the creek. We were boxed in. But then I looked at the fireplace. The wood was dry and the fire I'd started was roaring. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "If he comes through that door, you don't hesitate," I told her, my voice low and fierce. "You aren't protecting him anymore. You aren't protecting his interests. You're protecting your life." She looked at me, and for the first time that night, the fog in her eyes seemed to clear. The years of grooming, the months of sedatives, the vitamins that kept her compliant, they all seemed to burn away in the heat of that moment. She wasn't the special partner he'd promised she'd be. She was a line item on a spreadsheet. She was a shield. She was a victim who had finally found the bottom of the pit. "I'm not coming back, David," she screamed, her voice finally finding its strength. "I'm not your new energy. I'm a human being and I'm done." The response was immediate. The door didn't just open, it was kicked in with such force that the frame splintered. David stepped into the cabin, looking remarkably composed for a man who had just broken into a house. He was wearing a high-end designer coat and leather gloves. He looked like he was heading to a board meeting, not a crime scene. He looked at the gun in my cousin's hand and sighed. "Really, Chloe? This is so cliché. You've been watching too many movies." He took a step forward, and I saw the movement in his peripheral vision. He wasn't alone. Two other men, younger and much larger, stepped into the light behind him. They weren't consultants. They were muscle. "The drive," David said, holding out a gloved hand. "Now. And maybe I'll let your cousin drive home. But you and I have a lot to talk about. You've been very, very naughty." The way he spoke to her, like she was a pet that had ruined a rug, made my blood boil. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just swung the iron poker with everything I had. I wasn't aiming for him. I was aiming for the large kerosene lantern sitting on the side table near the door. The glass shattered, and the fuel ignited instantly. A wall of fire erupted between us and the door, the flames licking up the dry wood of the cabin. The muscle-bound guys jumped back, shielding their faces, and even David's mask of composure finally cracked into a look of pure, unadulterated fury. "Go!" I screamed, grabbing my cousin's arm. We didn't go for the front door. We ran for the kitchen, toward the small back exit that led to the creek. We burst out into the night, the cold air hitting us like a physical blow. Behind us, I could hear David screaming orders, his voice high and thin, stripped of its mature veneer. We scrambled down the embankment, the mud slick under our feet. I could hear them coming behind us, their heavy boots thudding on the frozen ground. We didn't have a plan. We just had the darkness. We waded into the creek, the water so cold it felt like needles piercing my skin, and we huddled under the overhang of a fallen willow tree. We watched as the cabin, my grandfather's cabin, the place of my childhood summers, went up in flames. The orange light cast long, dancing shadows across the woods. We saw the three figures silhouetted against the fire. They looked for us for what felt like hours, their flashlights cutting through the trees like searchlights. But they didn't find us. Maybe they thought we were trapped inside. Maybe they didn't want to risk being caught in the light of the fire. Eventually, we heard the sound of their SUV engines roaring to life, and the spray of gravel as they sped away. We stayed in that freezing water until the fire burned down to glowing embers. We didn't move until the sun started to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. We walked 5 miles to the nearest highway. When a state trooper finally pulled over, seeing 2 frostbitten, soot-covered women walking along the shoulder, my cousin didn't cry. She didn't try to hide. She just walked up to the window, pulled the USB drive from her pocket, and said, "I have a story to tell you, and I have the receipts." The aftermath was a whirlwind that didn't stop for months. The FBI took the drive, and the social club collapsed like a house of cards. David was arrested 3 days later at a private airport, trying to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The men on those videos? Some of them are still in court. Some of them resigned in disgrace. David is currently serving a 20-year sentence for racketeering extortion, and several counts related to the grooming of minors. But the happy ending isn't as clean as it sounds in the movies. My cousin is safe, physically, but the damage done to a person's soul when they realize their first true love was a calculated business move, that doesn't just go away. She's back in school now, trying to reclaim the years she lost. But she's different. She's quieter. She looks at everyone with a layer of suspicion that breaks my heart. The family is still picking up the pieces. My uncle doesn't talk much anymore. He feels like he failed her, and no matter how many times we tell him he didn't know, he can't let it go. And me? I'm the one who had to burn down my grandfather's cabin to save her. I'm the one who saw the monster behind the mature mask. Looking back, I realized that my reaction in that coffee shop, the "you're kidding, right?" was just the beginning. I thought I was judging her for dating an old man, but what I was really doing was sensing the danger before I even had a name for it. We like to think that love is a private thing, that it's nobody's business who we date. But when love is used as a weapon to isolate, control, and destroy, it becomes everyone's business. I don't know if she'll ever fully recover. I don't know if she'll ever stop looking for validation in the eyes of people who want to own her. But I do know she's alive, and in this story, that's the only win we're going to get. If you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Would you have cut her off to protect yourself, or would you have stayed and fought earlier? It's a terrifying thing to realize that the people we love can be so easily manipulated by a predator with a plan. Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever seen a relationship like this that felt more like a trap than a romance? Share your thoughts, and if you want to hear more stories about the dark side of human nature and the strength it takes to escape, make sure you hit that subscribe button.